Okay, boom. And we are live. I want to thank everyone for tuning in to a very special edition of Off the Record on the People's Podcast this evening. We have a magnificent guest with us tonight, one who is going to give us some amazing information as well as inspiration. And that is none other than the world renowned historian and author himself, Jonathan. I want to say Buchwalter, but he's going to give us the correct pronunciation of his name. How do you pronounce your name, sir?
It is Buchwalter. So put a little stank on the H, and the W sounds like a V. So Buchwalter.
Buchwalter. All right, got it, got it. Yes, sir. All
My
right.
students call me Mr. B, so we'll just go with that.
Okay, great. Well, the first question that we have for you tonight, sir, is when did you first develop a love for history?
I think the first, like, earliest memory I have of connecting with history was thanks to my eighth grade social studies teacher, Mr. Bowman. And he would always get really animated in the lessons he would teach. He had this like stick, it was like a painter's stick. And when
Mm-hmm.
we were learning about war, it was a sword or a gun. When we were learning about the philosophers of ancient Greece, it was a walking stick, and he would pontificate while kind of, feigning being an old man with a stick. And he just really poured his heart into it, and it connected me with people that I first saw as characters, as these sort of unreal beings from the past. And then the more I grew and developed and began professional training, the more I saw as human beings who had experiences not all that different than ours, and
Mm.
except for being removed in context and time.
Wonderful. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And what advice would you give to people like myself, who is a history major, and others who have a desire to not just study but master history?
Sorry, my cat wants to be in the show, and he's going to be all around the camera if I don't just bring him in.
All
Um,
right.
I would recommend first, the internet is a great place to start to discover things you're interested in. I think if you're trying to develop a more professional understanding of the field and develop yourself in the field, turning off the computer and going to the library is going to be the best thing for your brain and the best
Mm-hmm.
thing for your mental health as well.
Excellent. Yes, sir. Now, I saw you uh, day before yesterday on TikTok, and you were explaining history, but the history of slavery and the slave masters and the relationships of the husband, and in a very unique way, in a way I've never heard it spoken about. Could you let us know how did you, get that side of history, and what made you want to study that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel a deep connection to the history that touches me. So I'm German Irish and I live in the American South. And that means that the history I focus on follows immigrant labor, follows Southerners and their experience in the South. My field, where my discipline rests, where I'm the most knowledgeable, is on Nazism and the Holocaust. I study political philosophy around the Second World War pretty extensively and have for about 10 years. But I've always been fascinated by the American South and these contradictions that stack up around us. And you're from Atlanta, you probably see them in ways different than me, that you come from a more urban environment than I do, a much more densely packed environment, but one
Mm,
that's just as rooted in old Americana, right? The American South, the American Southeast has been largely unchanged since the founding and since the earliest expeditions west to settle it. But with this topic specifically, and with American slavery and the video that you're referencing, I'm bringing in data from probably the three most influential books on the subject for me. The first is John Baptiste's The Half Has Never Been Told. The second is a collection of primary source documents. It's memoirs, diary entries, and letters from slavers called The Fall of the House of Dixie. And then the third is a biography of President Ulysses Grant. It is called Grant, the Man Who Saved the Union. And these three books together really painted a beautiful and terrifying picture of American slavery as a social institution, as an economic institution, as an engine that would ultimately power a war machine and rip the country in half. And so the story that I'm telling in that TikTok that has just done numbers I did not expect, um, is one of, I think, a human element that is often lost when we speak about historical events, as if For example, I think the founding fathers are done the dirtiest in this way of like making men into these monoliths, these larger than life paragons of wisdom and virtue. And it's like, no, George Washington was like really cute with his wife and had some really, really confusing, contradicting opinions about slavery and human nature. And yeah, Alexander Hamilton did write like hundreds of the Federalist paper, excuse me, nearly 100 of the Federalist paper documents that are foundational for our nation. And that does entitle that man to a level of loftiness in history that most people wouldn't achieve. He also cheated on his wife with a sex worker, and he flirted with his wife's sister, and rumors abound as to whether or not they were just really good friends and talked like that, or if there was something more going on. And
Mm,
he might have been a gay man. He had a really intense and intimate beyond what you would expect friendship with two men in his life. One, a Prussian army officer that came over to train American troops, and the other, one of his staffers, one of his assistants on staff. And these were humans, these were people. And they lived these human people, complicated lives in a different time than ours, and very troubling times to be sure, but that doesn't make them any less people. And I wanted to bring that thinking. One of my mentors in undergrad called it history from below, where you're looking at history not as this collection of grand narratives, events, and timelines. You're looking at it through the eyes of the people that were there. And so when I'm talking about the paranoid planter who is worried his wife is cheating on him, we can frame planter culture as this um, Southern institution in which it was, and completely lose that, John Planter, right, the guy, the dude who owns the plantation, is a human being with a life and with desires and with competing ambitions and anxieties. And I think presenting the atrocities of our history, like American slavery, through this human lens lets us better understand why it existed and why it fell apart the way that it did and why it took so damn long to fall
mm,
apart.
mm. Great. Yes, sir. And thank you very much. And thank you, people, for showing you love all around the world. Thank you to everyone who continues to send positive energy to our guests. The People's Podcast is, I like how you said history from below. We like to use individuals and tell their personal stories. We're going to ask you some personal, your journey, but as well as what you're saying about the Civil War, World War II, and other wars. I wanted to stay right there. When you say why it took so long, why did slavery take so long?
That's a really hard question, and there's debate. I think there's really good spirited debate in the academic community about the answer to that question. So if you're looking at history through a more critical lens, which seems to be the ascendant vein of history, it's certainly been the one propelled forward by online discourse, is critical scholarship. I hesitate to call it all critical theory. That's a specific box of history and social science, but critical scholarship that wants to attack grand narratives and do this history from below. They would say something along the lines of slavery was the economic driver of the world, and regardless of anyone's intentions or beliefs, the West was dependent like a meth addict on slavery, such
Mm,
that the abolitionists could hem and haw as much as they wanted to, could gain political power as much as they wanted to, could contest the system from within and without as much as they wanted to, that the institutions of the world were too dependent and so would not relinquish it no matter what, no matter how convincing a moral argument was made, no matter how challenged the system became by alternative modes of production. We see the rise of industrial capitalism in the North, for example, that used free labor and was substantially more efficient than the slave labor in the South. And so even when these new systems were rising that could have reached the desired end goal faster and more efficiently, that the world is too dependent and so would not relinquish this incredibly predatory system. If you're looking at a more personalized flavor of history, so it really depends on what sources you're emphasizing and what sources you're de-emphasizing. And if you're emphasizing more individual stories of history, then you will find this paranoid planter class. You will
mm,
find this not large in population size, but outsizing, like massively large in political influence class of large landowners, large populations of slaves under their whip, And these people were like the saddest, most pathetic little freaks you've ever seen in your life.
Mm,
And they go to Washington because the planters are electing the planters in the South. And they go to Washington with maximum cynicism of how can we undermine anything and everything that might get in the way of slavery. And so, even when by the 1850s, especially, you have this mass movement of anti slavery, and it is morally grounded abolitionists, people like John Brown. It is politically grounded people like Abraham Lincoln, who is an opponent of slavery. Eventually, he comes around to a more total opposition to slavery, but he is an opponent to what slavery is doing to the Union, right? He isn't making a moral argument like the abolitionists are, he's making a political argument. Then you have the Free Soilers. This is a rising political party that is angry at slavery from moral grounds, but not because of what it does to black people, but because of what it does to white people. And say this
mm,
is stealing jobs from white farmers. This is the bullying planter class taking political authority that is undue to them, that they don't deserve the power that they're wielding. And all of these influences and individual decisions are compiling together in Washington, D.C., in the House of Representatives specifically, to the point where once the slavers have dragged the system along limping as far as they can, using the Electoral College to maximize their influence, using the Three-Fifths Compromise to maximize their influence, finding again through this path of maximum cynicism, um, around any sort of reform or compromise that anti-slavery politicians proposed for the entirety of the 19th century, that when all of that is failing by the mid 50s, they just start fighting in Congress. There are
mm,
multiple recorded stabbings on the floor of the House of Representatives. And
mm,
this begins almost exclusively by the early 1850s, instigated by the slavers, that some bill would come forward and the speaker calls the House to order and says, all right, we're going to discuss the Don't Do Slavery Act. And some Southern politician would just stand up and I want to take you outside for a duel. You have insulted my honor and the honor of my entire region, and we're going to go outside and have a pistol duel about it. And
mm,
like, these guys would shoot at each other in the House of Representatives about it. And then by the early 1860s, only just before the Civil War is breaking out, the Union congressmen finally give up any notion of like, oh, we can act in good faith with these people. And they just start bringing knuckle dusters to the
mm,
House of Representatives. There are full blown brawls in the House. And so if you're doing a critical analysis of history, you're seeing this economic dependence and an institution that almost wills itself into existence. But if you're doing a more personal history, more study of individual action and belief of history, which is ultimately what I continue to come back to as something that I prefer of the two. You see people, you see human beings who are acting towards their own interests. And of course, in relation to slavery, as we approach the 1860s, those interests are becoming harder to support by nonviolent means. And so they're just beating the shit out of each other about it.
mm. Okay, well, thank you for this great history and people are showing you love. Thank you, since Naima says peace, Mimi, peace. Thank you all for watching. Can't wait to upload to YouTube. All right, well, I wanted to ask one of in the story that you said something I never heard before, where you said the woman, the wife, the slave master wife,
Mm-hmm.
would have in her mind overlook if a slave child or a child from a slave resembled her husband.
Mm-hmm.
Like, talk about that. Talk about that.
Yeah, holy shit. So this is just blanket content warning. And I'm going to try to choose my words carefully so that when this ends up on YouTube, you don't get demonetized. Um, so we have a very different context for what love and relationships and physical intimacy are in our modern day than someone 100 years ago, than someone 200 years ago, and further back. To the point where if you went to pre-colonial the pre-colonial world, before settlers are arriving, before the conflicts with the natives, and you found just two schmucks of the same social class, and you said, "Why are you getting married?" And one of them would say, "Well, their family has goats and my family has sheep, and we can keep the wealth in the family by marrying." And say, "Okay, but don't you love your wife?" And they would just laugh at you. They'd be like, well, "Why would I do that? Like, what's that love doesn't get me more sheep?" And and so marriage in a Western European sense is this resource-based institution. It's a political institution for a very long time. For like most of the existence of what we would call like the modern Western world, it's this political, it's this economic institution. And the South sees itself, the American South sees itself as very culturally English. And so they're bringing this English culture of marriage as politics with them. And it was practiced around the country, but it was, especially when you're talking about the thousands of acres and hundreds of slaves that are changing family hands as a result of marriage, death, and whoever's having kids, you get a system of marriage where it is not uncommon at all for a planter's son and a planter's daughter to be arranged ahead of time to be wed, that they might have interacted a few times when they were kids. And the expectation is that they're going to come together in holy matrimony and say their vows before the church. And then what happens after that is entirely up to them, as long as you keep it to yourself, as long as you don't bring it back home, as long as
Hmm.
nobody finds out, then nobody's going to ask. Because the understanding is that this person doesn't really love their spouse, and that love, as they would have meant it, as they would have interpreted it, wasn't a part of the equation. Now, of course, people did marry for love and always have. And of course, people who were in these marriages and came to depend on one another and shared resources and triumphs and defeats, they came to fall in romantic love with each other, as anybody who would struggle alongside someone for long enough probably would. And so, in the case of the planter's wife wondering if the slave, the light skinned slave in the field, looks like her husband, it was a common and well known practice for male planters and their staff to assault the women of the plantation. American slavery is unique in the world because of the legal status that the slave exists at. Slavery is not new. Slavery is not Western. It is not American. Slavery has been a part of civilized humanity for as long as there have been people living in civilizations. But what made American slavery so unique and so immediately brutal compared to so many other forms of it around the world is the legal status of chattel that the slave existed in. So they would be property in the fullest sense of the word, meaning no access to legal recourse, where in other places and in other times, slaves had some semblance of legal protection. And you can go
Hmm.
as far back in the ancient world where you can read the Old Testament biblical texts of if a master beats his slave and the
Yeah,
slave
yeah,
dies within a
yeah.
certain amount of days, the master is accountable for that, right? That is a grisly thing to think about, but it is a way to show us that they expect certain treatment for owned persons. And that doesn't exist in the American Deep South, especially. In the
Hmm.
Carolinas, you would have a sort of buffer zone between the more egalitarian North and the opposite of egalitarian South, where the notion of free Black people in the community wouldn't have been strange. Intermarriage would have been almost entirely non existent and would have been kept far from the public eye if and when it existed. But in the Deep South, you have the labor camp system, right? The plantation system. And so these women, the slave women, are property. Their offspring are property. They're bought and sold in bulk. They are given new names. Sometimes when they change to new plantations, they're given new names. The notion of considering this human being as a person is not something that any of the slavers would have viewed. They would not have seen Matilda over there as a human being that would be worthy of any status whatsoever.
Hmm.
And so when the planter wanted to have a roll around in the hay, he just would. He would just go take it from her. And if you were Matilda, in this case, our hypothetical person, you knew better than to fight back. And you knew better than to even pretend that you didn't like it, because it
Hmm.
could be immediate physical violence. If you were the person that Matilda was romantically involved in or involved with, you knew better than to fight back. You would close your ears and pretend it wasn't happening. And when that kid came out, you, yes, sir, this is my son. and you would just keep going as if it didn't happen,
Mm.
because it didn't happen. And for that planter's wife, who is probably in a loveless marriage, whose husband is traveling on business a lot, and plantation owners were often out of the home. They were traveling around the South and going to port communities, especially trying to secure shipping contracts. And so you're in a loveless marriage, you're in a marriage that has almost no physical intimacy. You know that your husband isn't intimate with you. So who is it that he's intimate with?
Mm.
And you can look out into the yard and see little Johnny out there, who is distinctly lighter skinned than his mother and supposedly his father.
Mm.
And man, those cheekbones sure do look familiar.
Mm.
And for the male planter, this is his open secret. He knows he's doing it. All his friends know he's doing it. Anyone with authority in the community knows he's doing it. But as long as he doesn't bring it into his marriage bed, and as long as nobody can say for sure, oh, yeah, you and that one and that kid, then nobody's going to look twice at it.
Mm.
Nobody's going to mention it. Because anyone who would look twice, who would mention it, they're doing it too.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you for this it's very deep history. All right, man. And thank
Yeah,
you.
it's
People
horrifying.
are
It's
showing
utterly
love and, huh?
it's horrifying. It's utterly horrifying.
Yes, sir. Okay, now you have a book. What is the name of your book and how can we support your book?
Okay, totally. We'll do a hard pivot, right? We'll do a hard pivot to happier stories. So, so I write science fiction. The first book in my trilogy is called The Night Sky Darker. The second book called Fire in the House of God.
Mm.
Um, and they are a sort of love letter to all the things that were inspirational to me. And so I grew up watching Star Wars with my mom. We didn't have a whole lot when I was a kid, but we had a VHS player and the
Mm.
original Star Wars on VHS tape. And
Mm.
man, we watched those until the tapes failed. And so it is very Star Wars in one respect, it is very history in another. I try to ground my villains in real world villains. I've based all of my antagonists loosely off of several real people, sort of compiling their stories together into some um, fiction appropriate monster for
Mm.
my characters to fight. And my goal with the series is to create a space for people to engage safely with what can be really distressing historical concepts that are much more approachable when it's the action hero Liam fighting the evil space bad guys, the Federation. And you can tell that story in a way that has clean heroes and villains and present these concepts in a way that's approachable and digestible and fun and exciting. You want to watch the bad guy lose, you want to watch the good guy win. And then after you can sit back and go, okay, how does this parallel to real life? How can I engage with history through this fiction? And see, the story in real life is a lot uglier and a lot more complicated, but those parallels are there. And I've had a blast writing it. I'm finishing the trilogy this year. So by December is my deadline for book 3, The Stars Themselves Shall Weep. And
Okay, okay.
ending, and I'm just so excited to be done with it. It's on Amazon. The Night Sky Darker is book 1. It got print and ebook and all that good stuff.
Excellent. And I want everyone who's watching now, thank you all for all of the love that we're sending to our guest. Let's make sure we get his book. And we have a brief, we come back, we got a few more questions for you. A brief 60-second commercial break for all of the sponsors of the People's Podcast. We are grateful for every like, share, and subscription. Thank you for every anonymous Cash App. And we're coming back to our illustrious guest with his phenomenal history, and we're going to learn more about his science fiction. And we are live with the People's Podcast. Street Premiere Media Production. He has a 4K camera and a drone. He does television and film editing. Please reach out if you need any of that. Sister Naima, Stay On Point Dance Academy. She teaches ballet virtually to young girls all across the country. Sister Miriam, ABC I Love Me children's book and coloring book. My father's book, A Soldier in the Movement of Christ. My 2 books, Cleopatra, which is a children's book, and No Father, No Excuse, both of which are available on Amazon. Boom. Perfect. Okay. Yes, sir. And right back. We're back. Yes, sir. Wonderful. All right. So we went over the Civil War. Now let's your primary focus as far as being a historian is dealing with World War II, the Nazis and the Holocaust, correct?
Yes, I study Nazism and the Holocaust, not so much the battlefield history of World War II, that is undoubtedly fascinating. But Nazism and the Holocaust as historical events and political ideology.
Yes, sir. And for people who are not historians, what would you say would be the first introduction into them learning more about Nazism and the Holocaust?
The first place I would send someone, if you are a documentary watcher, there is a new, like brand new documentary series on Amazon called Adolf Hitler, and it is really, really good. Like really, really, really good. They bring in, I was so excited when I was watching it because several of my favorite historians were interviewed for the documentary. And so you get little, they'll do the historical footage and then they'll do an actor reenactment. And then it's like, there's Dr. Evans, who is one of the biggest scholars in the world in this subject, just doing his thing that he's better than everyone at. And it was really cool, really well done. That's where I would send people first, I think. If you would prefer to read or listen to an audiobook, then I think Dr. Evans's Coming of the Third Reich trilogy is probably the strongest introduction academically, excuse me, that approaches Nazism and Hitlerism from all of its aspects at once from the sort of top down view. And the strongest, the most engaging book on the subject, the most engaging book that I've read is um, oh God, it's a hard tie actually. Um, One is In the Garden of Beasts by Eric Larson, and if any of your fans are history buff people, they know Eric Larson. He is just phenomenal. He's such a good
Mm,
storyteller. But In the Garden of Beasts follows Dr. James Dodd. He was the ambassador to Germany. He was the ambassador in Berlin from the United States, and it's he and his family's experience living under Nazi rule for several years as Americans, coming with no context at all other than like a few newspaper articles they read, and then ending up, really in the belly of the beast. And then the other end of the tie is a book that I just finished yesterday called
mm,
They Thought They Were Free. And it is an interview with 10 Germans. The interviews were conducted in the 1950s, so it's like immediately after World War II ends. And it is an interview with 10 Germans who were and still, as of the time of writing, as of, I think 1954, were still Nazis, that they were ardent Hitler supporters before, during, and after the war, and it humanizes them and shows you the world through their eyes in a way that's really hard to find anywhere else.
yes, sir. Excellent. And thank you, everyone who's watching. Okay, so World War II seems to be like the Civil War is my favorite, you know, type of, dealing with historically. Civil War is just something I'm very fascinated by. But World War II is close second. What makes World War II so fascinating to people just in film and TV? There's so many books, so many movies, video games, so many
Yeah,
Call of Duties, surround World War II. What makes World War II so fascinating to people?
yeah. I mean, we could have had like I, I don't know, Korean War zombies, but we don't. We have
Mm,
Nazi zombies in the Call of Duty games, right? I think part of it is that the U.S. government did a really just knockout job of a propaganda campaign right
mm,
as the start of World War II, right as America joins in. So after Pearl Harbor goes down, the largest voice against American entry was an organization called the America First movement. And a lot of those guys in the America First movement were on Hitler's payroll, right? They were just Nazi spies bought by the Hitler government to sow doubt in the United States. And
mm.
once World War II begins and America is in a crisis footing, the federal government has a lot of powers to censor and restrict information and organizing that it doesn't have in peacetime. And so, as soon as World War II starts and the federal government switches to wartime mode, we see a lot of these pro Nazi groups like the German Bund, like the America First movement. We see them just evaporate. Some of them go on their own, knowing that the game is up, and others are censored, that there's you can't publish these things anymore. And in the wake of that, the US government starts just shoveling money at Hollywood to make cool movies. And they do, they make some really banger movies. There's one, oh my God, what is the name of it? It's Confessions of a Nazi Spy. And it is a dramatized sort of reenactment almost. It's presented like a reenactment, but it's a spy thriller about this Nazi spy that got captured by U.S. intelligence services and was like confessing all the things that he was involved in working as an agent for Hitler. Captain America comes out from Marvel, and it's just a beautiful piece of Americana. The United States federal government is taking a lot more aggressive stances on combating segregation law in ways that it couldn't during peacetime, to say, all right, if you are a wartime industry, you can no longer segregate. And so
Mm,
we have these notions of American unity and equity that we didn't before. We have this rah rah America drumbeat that is just pounding to get the country that was really genuinely divided on entering the war all on deck. Say, well, we're going to be drafting like millions of you guys, and we need patriots, not doubters. And then, while we have what is, at least at first, this notion of state on state conflict with an undercurrent, an accurate undercurrent of democracy versus authoritarianism, then we start liberating concentration camps. And once the images and testimonies of the people who experienced the Holocaust make it back to the United States, the narrative of the war goes from being this sort of rah rah drumbeat, we're America and these guys suck and we're going to whoop them sort of footballification of conflict, into, oh no, this is a force of abject evil. Like, these
mm,
people are monsters, and if we don't stop them, they'll put us in camps too. And so
mm,
you have this sort of, like every country does in every conflict ever, rah rah drumbeat of America, World War II, we're the best. And then it becomes authentic of like, oh no, these people are demons. And freedom and justice and liberty are on the line, and they will have us put up against the wall because the Soviets are reporting that they're finding mass graves full of civilians, and they will throw us in the chambers because our airborne boys just liberated a camp and found these train cars full of emaciated bodies just left to rot. And we have to stop these people, for the notion no longer of state versus state and sort of this military code of justice that you invaded and you aggressed, and so we must retaliate to preserve our statehood. And instead, it's we must defeat you because you are evil and you represent this threat to basic human decency. And that notion of a pure war, of a good war, has never really existed. And in the rare moments when it does, you see this enormous outpouring of sort of national unity around it. We see it in the American Civil War as well, that as Union troops are going south and they're seeing slavery for the first time, the whipped backs, the broken bodies, the emaciated people on these labor camps, um, and the notion of like, oh, those dastardly Southerners, we're going to whip them to heel, turns to, oh shit, this is evil, and we have to stop it. And I think that notion of the good war, of a war that America walks out of obviously morally right, it feels really good for a country whose place in the world has always been controversial, and whose actions at home and abroad have always been this mix of beautiful and ugly. And to say, no, here, this one moment in history, as USGIs are bringing in food to starving concentration camp inmates, for this one shining moment, we were who we say we are. We
mm.
are the freedom and justice. We are the thing that we promised we would be. And that, man, that is powerful. And that message can land for God's densest 15-year-old boy playing Call of Duty.
Mm, mm, mm. Excellent. Yes, sir. Okay. Well, speaking of Call of Duty in movies and film, there's a term that is often used, which we see throughout history, but now, even up to present time, propaganda.
Yeah,
How important is propaganda to history, and how important is propaganda to the winning of a war?
I think that's a loaded question, right? There's two questions in that one. So, how important is it to history? I think we sort of up in the ivory tower, we historians who are studying history and producing academic works, and occasionally can be bothered to come down and make an engaging documentary film or advise on a movie. Um, we see it as just another thing to study, as just another thing to look at, as a way to understand how the state wants the people to engage with the state, or how they want it to engage with the outside world, or whatever, as just another tool in the toolkit of the state to mobilize social cohesion. As far as popular history is concerned, as far as how the average person engages with history, I think that most people are content to eat the propaganda whole,
Mm,
because it is a complete picture and it is a simple picture, and
mm.
everybody's got kids to feed and a job to do, and they're stressed about that coworker that was wearing them out. And so, no, Mr. Random Historian, I'm not going to read Hannah Arendt, what, 70-year old? No, I think she's dead now, actually. But I'm not going to read the seminal work of Hannah Arendt, The Origins of Totalitarianism,
Mm.
which was written in the 1950s and is like 600 pages long and was not approachable for a general audience because she wasn't writing for a general audience. Like, no, I'm going to go work my 8 hours in the factory. I'm going to come home and make my chicken tendies for my kids and ask them about their day and help them with their math homework. I'm not
Mm.
going to read 4 tomes of political philosophy and then to historians to try and critically analyze it. And the propaganda makes it accessible.
Yes, sir. Okay, great, great. And once again, I want to make sure that we all support you. Can you let us know your TikTok so we can follow you on social media as well?
Yes, you can find me on TikTok at Johnster Truck. So like monster, but with a J, Johnster Truck.
Wonderful. Now, I want to go back to your books. I'm a huge Star Wars fan. In fact, I was speaking to uh, someone who was interested in dating me or being in a relationship with me, and she was like, "Well, what do you want to name some of your children?" And I was giving her some like Arabic names, deep names. And I was like, "Yeah, this might be another name named Anakin." She was, "Oh, how could you? How
Broke
could
in
you?"
casually. Like, I was thinking Joshua Muhammad II, or like Anakin Skywalker Muhammad.
And she didn't understand. And so I was like, no, let me say something. You got to watch Star Wars episode one, two, three. Then you will begin. Then we'll go to four, five, and six. Let's just start one, two, and three. We'll deal with the Clone Wars later. But let's just deal with one, two, so you understand who Anakin is. You know what I'm saying? So she didn't necessarily. She wasn't necessarily excited at first, but it is what it is. What makes you so fascinated by Star Wars?
I think there's one part of it is like it speaks to the niche that I think has just defined me as a person of like, if I get into something, I want to get all the way into it.
Mm,
And so when that means history, it's like, no, we're getting a master's degree and we're starting a TikTok page and we're doing this as our career. And then also in my off hours, and like, I want to go all the way in. And with Star Wars, it's one of the few pieces of media that has enough that you can. And so, like, yeah, you get
mm,
your 3 originals, but then you get your 3 prequels. And then
yeah,
there are
yeah.
like a bunch of animated series. Some of them are canon and some of them aren't. There's whole comic book lines. Do you want the book series as well? These are all in trilogies too. And I can just go all the way in. I can fully immerse myself in it. And the other part of it that's a little more human and a little more endearing, is that me and my mom, because dad wasn't around when I was a kid, and I mean when I was dad is not around. I have never met my father. And so we lived with my grandparents and we were broke as a joke, and mom worked nights. And of all the things we didn't have, the thing that we did have was a VCR and Star Wars. And man, when I tell you I watched that damn movie over and over and over. And so, like, by the time I'm an adult, Star Wars is my place of safety and comfort. Like when it's hard, it's the day sucked, or I had a big assignment or whatever, it's like I'm gonna go home and I'm gonna watch A New Hope, and the good guys are gonna win, and Luke's gonna blow up the Death Star, and it's gonna be really cool. And it always is. It's always really cool.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I'm glad you said that. Speaking of mothers, my mother, Sharifa Muhammad, she's a huge Star Wars fan. A lot of people didn't understand it, like they didn't know, but she liked uh, episode four, five, and six. That's what she came up on.
Mm-hmm.
I never got to see in the movie theater. She loved Billy D. Williams, and so she was all like, "Josh, you got to see four, five, and six." And I did not get into Star Wars until I was in high school age because that's when the prequels were coming out. So a lot of people give the prequels like it's almost like they make fun of them or it's like mockery. But those are my,
Oh yeah, no, the same.
those the prequels is what made me like Anakin, what made me understand my mother would put on the Ewoks, and I was like, I'm not into none of this, mama. And then once I saw the prequels, I was like, okay, I understand. Now I see why there's a Darth Vader. And do you think? How do you think the prequels hold up? And what about the Netflix shows like The Mandalorian or Obi-Wan? Do you like those or
I think so with the prequels, um, they are absolutely bad in the way that is most charming and enjoyable, and like I will watch Attack of the Clones whenever it's put in front of me, and I will cheer during the pod racing scene of Phantom Menace, no matter how out of place and pointless it is. But like, okay, we have this political soap opera, this space soap opera, and we're gonna stop for 30 minutes for kid death race, and then we're
Hmm.
never gonna talk about it ever again. And it's like, I don't care that it's shit. I don't. It's awesome. It's so cool. And episode three, man, like you want to talk about the best movie with the worst writing? There is not a single line of dialogue in that entire film that doesn't come off like cardboard. And it's my favorite one. It's so good. It's just so cool the whole time. And I think um Andor, I'm assuming you've seen Andor.
Of course.
Um Masterpiece, just breathtaking. Like
Hmm.
Star Wars, peak Star Wars. Um, Obi-Wan was kind of lame, but the parts of it that were good enough for me to be like, yeah, I'll put up with the weird hokey chase scene where like the villains are trying to catch Leia, but they're like tripping over trees and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, okay, that was lame as hell. But then like we got to see Hayden Christensen as Darth Vader with half his mask
Absolutely.
off, and like, yeah, man, sure, chase her around the tree. I'll sit through that for the Darth Vader scene. Mandalorian, I will be forever grateful for because my wife was like, "Nah," on Star Wars, and then Mandalorian season one comes out really early on in her and I's relationship, and she was like, "Oh, I saw the baby Grogu thing on some poster, and that looks cute." And I'd sit down and watch this with you. Now she's worse than me. She's got it worse than I do with Star Wars. She was like, "Okay, so because our baby boy was just born, and she was like, we're gonna do a Star Wars themed nursery for him." And I was like, well, we don't have to. You know, I don't want you to feel like I would like make you that. Should know we're doing a Star Wars themed nursery.
Okay.
Yeah, fantastic, love that.
See, okay, that gives me hope. So everybody who's watching, shout out to Anakin, and I've been to Universal Studios and got to see like the whole Star Wars setup, and they bring out the stormtroopers. It's a whole
So
experience, and
cool.
yeah, I recommend that. All right, we have two more questions for our guests, and then we'll let you go. And thank you, everybody. We're gonna upload to YouTube. There's a question that we ask each guest. What is your favorite album of all time, sir?
Oh God, oh you're doing this to me. Oh, okay. So if we're going with recency bias, it is "This Place Will Become Your Tomb" by Sleep Token,
Okay.
because it's like the newest band that I've really gotten into. It's progressive metal. It's very much the thing for me. I think my favorite album of all time is "Keeping Secrets of Silent Earth" by Coheed and Cambria. And part of the
Okay.
reason for that one, for that band specifically, is their song "Lucky Stars" was my wife and I's first dance at our wedding. Because that's our favorite band. That's one of the first things we really bonded over was Coheed and Cambria's music. We've seen them live a bunch of times. It's just so good. And then because I can never do it just one. If you ask me what's my favorite X, like I can't tell you. I can never pick. Um, I think for three, I I really want to say it's "Damn" by Kendrick Lamar, but
Okay.
I'm
Okay.
not sure if it's that album because the album is objectively good. I'm not
Okay.
sure if it's that album or it's just how good "Humble" was
Okay.
compared to basically everything that came out in the mid 2010s.
Okay. But man, that's those are very unique albums, and I must say it's a first for the first two albums. We shout out to the heavy metal and the way you explained it. That's good as well. Thank you everyone who's watching and showing love to our guests. the last question that we ask is, what would you like your legacy to be, sir?
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, just like, oh, what's your favorite band? What do you want the world to remember you for? Like, God, Jesus. I think if you're gonna hold me down and make me on the spot, off the cuff, it would be that the students that I teach could see the potential that they have the same way that I do.
Mm,
At some point in their life, um, there's a young man named Justin, and he was like the first student that I ever really seriously mentored, worked with my first year as a teacher. Um, and it would just be everything to me if he lived up to the potential that I see in him, or one of my young ladies, Lauren, that she would live up to the potential that I see in her. Um, and if I died knowing that even a handful of them got to see them how I see them, then I did it okay. I did it all right.
mm. Excellent. Yes, sir. And I wanted to let you know that on behalf of myself, my family, and the viewing audience of the People's Podcast, we thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to come on the People's Podcast. We thank your family as well. Shout out to your wife and your child. The cat. You didn't say what your cat's name was.
Yeah, hold on. Let me go get Nori. He's right here.
Okay.
Oh, come here, big boy. This is Nori, and he
Okay.
is 15 pounds. He's a big boy.
Wow. All right, Nori. Okay, so I was thinking something you're gonna name it after Star Wars or something, but you went Nori. All right. So, I want to thank everybody who's watching. Thank you again, sir. This is
Thank you.
Joshua. This is Joshua Leonard Muhammad signing off of the People's Podcast. Thank you all. Thank you for watching. Have a great night, sir.
Thanks, guys. Have a great night, everyone.